Dear all, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the launch of our Renewable Energy Job Annual Review 2020. I think this report is on a very timely topic. The ongoing COVID pandemic already had far-reaching consequences on our societies. Millions lost their lives or livelihoods, and economies are in sharp downturn. Creating jobs and kickstarting recovery is right along the top of the agenda of policymakers. As they are designing unprecedented stimulus packages, it is important that we make sure that this money is spent in areas that bring us closer to a better and more sustainable future. Putting the energy transition at the heart of the COVID recovery can do this. The report that we are launching today is a contribution to inform this discussion. It seeks to provide an understanding of the renewable energy job market to inform evidence-based decision-making for the way ahead. The report finds that renewable energy jobs worldwide grew to about 11.5 million in 2019, up from 7.3 million in 2012. As in the previous year, the solar PV industry is the single largest renewable energy employer with 3.8 million jobs. The leading renewable energy job market remain in China, Brazil, India, the US, and the European Union. Still, they are not alone. It is encouraging to see the numbers of countries that derive employment benefits keep growing across all regions. One dimension where we must do better is the gender balance. The share of women in the renewable workforce remains relatively low. It is better than fossil fuel, but there is no reason for complacency. Much remains to be done to level the playing field for women and to ensure that the sector benefits for their talent, skills, and ideas. IRENA is not only the reference point for estimate of current renewable energy employment. The agency is also leading on evaluating the needs and the opportunity for the energy transition. Our analysis on the post-COVID recovery, our agenda, find that globally the energy transformation could expand employment in the renewable energy sector to around 30 million in 2030. Of course, not every country or region fares equally well. Outcome depends on the pre-existing economic structure, on level of policy ambition, and also on the measure taken in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. As I mentioned, the ambitious recovery package we have proposed can foster economic development and job creation. It is essential that policy action and investment decisions are aligned with the vision of sustainable and just future that lives in reality, nobody behind it. For this, we need appropriate industrial, fiscal, trade, labor, and education and skill training policies to maximize job creation. Importantly, increasing the depth and diversity of domestic renewable energy value chains will also allow more and more countries and more people to derive the socio-economic benefits of the energy transition. To discuss this and more in detail, I will now hand over to Rabia Feruki, Director of IRENA Knowledge Policy and Finance Center, agenda focal point in the agency. She will share key findings from our reports to set the scene for the discussion. Thank you again for joining us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Director General. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to present key insights from the latest edition of our report, Renewable Energy and Jobs Annual Review. As was just mentioned by the DG, job creation is critical for decision-making and for the general public in economies throughout the world. This is especially the case with countries undertaking the energy transition to fulfill sustainable development goals. But this year has added another enormous challenge in the form of COVID. Economies that were at a halt. This triggered widespread unemployment or job loss and livelihoods. So as is often mentioned in our messaging, the short-term recovery really needs to be shaped in ways that can support the medium and long-term transformation of the energy system, but also of entire economies. Next slide, please. So before going into detail, I just want to highlight for you that our latest job findings are really part of a wide and solid knowledge base on the socio-economics of renewables and of the energy transition developed by IRENA over the years. So the report draws, of course, from the work that we do annually in terms of estimating how many people work in renewables, but it is also draws from the series on leveraging local capabilities that looks at opportunities for countries to create domestic value by leveraging their existing industrial and other capacities. We look at labor and material requirements along the segments of the value chains of renewable energy technologies. Of course, it draws on the gender work that we do. And finally, it draws on a series of reports based on econometric modeling of IRENA's energy transition scenarios to 2030, 2050, globally, regionally, nationally, where we project how the transition plays out in terms of GDP, human welfare, and employment, of course. Next slide, please. In this 7th edition, we look at the status of employment in 2019 around the world. Every year, we continue to really refine and improve data as well as the underlying methodology. So in this report, we highlight the latest employment trend by technology that includes decentralized applications for improved energy access. It offers information on leading countries and other selected regions as well, the trends, the dynamics, but also the factors that can explain why they are at that level of development in terms of job. It includes findings on the gender dimension, as mentioned by the Director General, and it points out also to better information on job quality, including workplace relations and wages. And finally, it looks at a few initiatives on education and training, which are very important to match the demand and the supply of skills and avoid the potential shortages as renewable deployment and the energy transition scales up. Next, please. So, as was mentioned in the introductory notes by the Director General, 11.5 million is the number, the estimate we have this year worldwide. So you see here the latest number, but also the trends from our previous report. So just to put the 11.5 million in perspective, because it just in relative to the sector as a whole, this is about 1/5 of all energy jobs in the world. So this is quite significant. Noteworthy is the fact that the over number have continued to grow systematically every year since we issued our first estimate in 2012. Of course, some renewable energy technologies have been much more dynamic than others. And we look at that in the next slide, please, where you see the solar PV industry that retains the top spot, as mentioned, 3.8 million. That's 33% of the total workforce in renewable energy. Other leading industries in the sector are liquid biofuels, as you can see, hydropower and wind, followed by the other technologies. Decentralized renewables, in particular solar technologies, are creating a growing number of jobs, even if statistics really don't yet capture them very well. We have provided a focus on 3 countries, Kenya, Nigeria, and India, and the evidence shows that substantial livelihoods are supported in this productive use of energy in local communities. Next slide, please. So now if you look at the jobs by countries and regions, it's really worth noting that a small number of countries, China, Brazil, India, the US, and members of the European Union remain prominent. This is not surprising because they are major installation markets, and they also play a significant role in manufacturing of equipment for renewable energy. And also, altogether, these countries really account for a very large share of the world's population. Next slide, please. So going into the same spirit, here are the top 10 in solar, wind, and biofuels, top 10 countries, sorry. If you see in 2019, 90% of global biofuels employment was concentrated in the top 10 countries. In solar PV, it was 87%, and in wind, 85%. China stands out as a dominant role in solar PV and in wind. In solar PV, even though the pace of domestic installation has slowed down, the country remains by far the largest exporter. Brazil remains again by far the largest biofuel employer. As in some other countries like India, Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, Vietnam, Colombia, many livelihoods are found in the in this labor-intensive agricultural supply chain. Finally, in offshore and offshore wind, you can see a number of European countries are strong, both in domestic installations, and they serve also export markets. Next slide, please. So, for other countries and regions, I'd like to say that despite the prominence that we find in a small number of countries that I just showed, our IRENA analysis also shows that renewable energy development allows growing number of countries to create jobs. This is particularly the case for PV. Countries like Malaysia, the Philippines, Vietnam have become significant manufacturers of PV panels for export, even if their domestic market is relatively small. You can also see on the slide an overview of additional countries from several regions we highlight in this edition, with the dynamics, trends, dynamics, and explanation of the developments that are going on. Next slide, please. As was mentioned by the DG, the number of renewables jobs keeps on growing. That's good news. But of course, men hold a higher share. And for us, achieving a better gender balance remains an important objective. And our work highlights all the opportunities that are there. I'm not going to go into the numbers since they were given before. But just one more mention is that the share in decentralized renewables seems to be also within that range of 25%. This is judging from the studies we have from Kenya, Nigeria, and India. But of course, more needs to be done to understand fully the decentralized market. Next one. Another dimension that demands increasing attention is a skilled workforce. Building the skills, the skill base that is necessary to support the ongoing global energy transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy, energy efficiency, and energy flexibility requires more vocational training, stronger curricula, more teachers training, more information and communication technologies for distant learning, etc. Our report highlights a number of selected initiatives in this field, but we really need many more such efforts. And it is very important that for governments to help coordinate between the renewable energy industry and the education and institutionals offering. Next one, please. But of course, education and training is just one aspect of an ambitious package of policies and investments to scale up renewable and create more jobs. Deployment policies are, of course, essential to accelerate the uptake of renewables, but they must go hand in hand with efforts to leverage and enhance local capacity through industrial policy, through labor market intervention and preservation of social equity, retraining opportunities for fossil fuel workers who might be at risk of losing their jobs, leverage on synergies between the traditional energy sector and renewable energy skills, because there are synergies, and finally design of investment programs that can invigorate national and local economies. So measures are needed both in the short term and medium long term to support the expansion and adequate energy transition workforce. Allow me to just a couple of minutes to give you a few measures that we highlight for you to keep in mind. In the short term, we do need to protect existing jobs and support new job creation. We need to introduce social protection measures for workers that are affected by COVID, create employment benefits by investing in decentralized generation, create new job opportunities by leveraging local capacities along the segments of the value chain of energy transition technologies, and offer reskilling for fossil fuel workers who have lost their job, and finally match skills demand and supply through active labor market policies. A couple of other measures in the more medium to long term, which is expanding the support to expand the workforce in energy transition related fields, identify the occupational requirements and leveraging existing skills, develop training and educational programs to minimize skills gap because they're already here, the skills gaps, and as I said, coordinate the education offering with the industry needs, and finally support the integration of renewable energy and climate topics into educational curricula, both for technical and non-technical disciplines. So the importance of ambitious policies only rises further in this quote-unquote brave new COVID influenced world we're in, and a holistic economic stimulus packages, but also recovery plans and policy framework can really drive structural and systemic shifts or changes that are needed in the energy sector and beyond. And this would foster national and regional transition strategies that can build more inclusive, just, and resilient economies. My last slide, please. If we put this thinking into practice, we will be able to create far more jobs in transition-related technologies. Our work, IRENA's modeling work, suggests that today's 11.5% can grow to 30 in a decade and to 42 million by 2050. This would, in 2050, represent 42% as compared to the 20% today. It would be 42% of the global energy workforce. But our estimates show as well that the transition pathway that IRENA is supporting would lead to an increase in jobs also in energy efficiency, to more than 2 times the level today, up to 21 million by 2050. And the same for energy system flexibility, where it would increase to about 15 million. That's almost 2 times the level today. So there is a lot of opportunity to be seized from developing all the framework required to gain benefits on employment from energy-related, transition-related technology. So this concludes my presentation. I now give the floor to Hans Olaf Ibreek, who serves as policy director in the sections for energy, climate, and food security in the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We have a long working relationship, a very close relationship with Hans Olaf on renewables and on SDGs, and we're very happy that he agreed to moderate our panel. Thank you, Hans Olaf.
Thank you very much, Rabia, for those nice words. And first of all, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. It's a great pleasure for me to moderate this event today. The annual jobs report is one of IRENA's annual flagship reports, and it's actually the 7th report in the series. The report analyzes the status of renewable energy employment in 2019 around the world, and the DG of IRENA and Rabia have just provided the key findings of the jobs report, including the approach that has been used in the report. For me, some of the striking facts that was presented by Francesco and Rabia was that employment in renewable energy worldwide was estimated at 11.5 million in 2019, up from 11 in 2018. So it's encouraging to see that it's growing. It's 1/5 of all energy jobs. Women hold 32% of the jobs, and that clearly indicates that has also been stated that we need to do more work in order to balance this out. Most jobs have been created in a small number of countries, most notably in China and Asia, which accounted for 63% of total jobs in renewables globally. But it's encouraging to see that employment benefits are actually showing up more widely. Off-grid decentralized renewables are creating a growing number of jobs, and we also, as been really highlighted, we need to increase our efforts to build the required skills base and the policy framework. Of course, we are all faced with COVID-19, and the question then, what will be the impacts of COVID-19 on the industry? And I guess that when IRENA will launch next year's report, then we'll see some figures that at least will indicate how the industry has dealt with COVID-19. And a key question also in terms of moving forward is actually how we design our stimulus packages and use this opportunity to build back better and greener. But now let me just go straight into the panel discussion. We have 6 panelists, and I think you have them on the screen. I don't see anything on the screen, so I'm a little bit uncertain, but we first have Susanne Pedersen, Assistant Director General from the Global Green Growth Institute. We have Vic van Buren, Director, International Labour Organization. Aurélie Beauvais, Policy Director, Solar Power Europe. Rebecca Shirley, Chief Research Officer, Power for All. Harish Hande, Selco Foundation, and Michael Renner, Program Officer and co-author of the report from IRENA. After the panel discussion, we will open up the floor for questions from the audience, of course, time permitting, and I would plead to my panelists that they stick to the allocated time, so we will have time for questions. And you can use the chat function to submit questions, and then we will then pick out a few of them, and it would be really nice if you address some of your questions specifically to some of the panelists, because that will help us in terms of moving forward. So then let's go straight into the matter. And first I would like to ask Susanne Pedersen a question. How can relevant knowledge of energy employment linkages best be improved and shared? And how can countries better prepare their human capital for the energy transition? Susanne, the screen is yours, as we say these days.
Thank you, Hans Olaf. As Hans Olaf mentioned, I'm representing the Global Green Growth Institute. That is an intergovernmental organization with 38 members, and we have operations in 33 countries supporting green growth and new pathways for economic growth across countries. And as such, renewable energy and the energy aspect is very dear to us. So we have prioritized also knowledge generation and dissemination on sustainable energy, green job issues. We did also a study in Mexico, Indonesia, and Rwanda that we published together with help from IRENA and others. We definitely proved there that there was a lot of renewable energy jobs to be had by investing in these sectors. We did a follow-up study where we supported specifically Mexico in looking at business as usual and what would happen if they were more ambitious in their NDC process, and tried to prove that it was definitely worth it. In terms of, you could say, how we can help countries, obviously in the development of energy strategies, plans, and roadmaps, we could incorporate more information on the potential for renewable jobs creation. This would prove to be valuable for policymakers, particularly in the context of COVID-19 economic recovery. And we could also help by looking at both the short-term and the long-term employment opportunities of renewable energy and climate action, and include that more in the NDC enhancement process and development of long-term emissions development strategies. Because if you assess and rate the various strategies against the job creation potential, then you could definitely make some good choices. You could also argue that donors or official development assistance organizations could ask to include this in the project requirements. You know, what is the employment generation potential? That could certainly improve the efficiency and the effectiveness of design of programs, that if you do this very early on. And of course, looking at different definitions, standards, indicators, taxonomies, etc., could also be, you know, continue that work. And at GGGI, we are very happy to be part of the Sustainable Energy and Jobs platform led by IRENA. And we are, you know, also eager to continue helping there. But of course, also the issue of availability of data is also still a challenge, especially in low-income countries, that it's not always that easy to get good data, and especially gender disaggregated data is hard to come by. But obviously, IRENA and others have made a good stab of it. In terms of, you know, how you can prepare the human capital better, obviously training programs for vocational training, promoting green innovation and entrepreneurship is really important. But it's also important that it's a just transition. And the aforementioned employment study we did show that in 3 countries, if you did investments in solar and wind technology, you could actually, in the short term, generate a strong need for low to medium skilled workers, which means that in the very short term, you could actually generate job opportunities by doing a bit of vocational training. And we also see that if you identify the locations with the highest, let's say, RE or renewable energy potential, and you can then also target your vocational training programs to those regions where good opportunity for investments in renewable energy is possible. In our aforementioned study, we did identify in Mexico, for instance, that there were 2 regions in particular where the need for or the opportunity for wind power was great, but there was in fact no vocational training, no technical universities, not a very good support education-wise for the expansion of the wind power sector. So we are discussing with the Mexican government right now how we can help them to actually train people and send them to that region. Then finally, I think it was mentioned before, vocational training of youngsters and others is very important. But even so, the technical universities, of course, play a big role in many countries. And we do need to also make sure that the curricula at the university level does include RE-related specialized subjects and courses that could really give students the required skills. And I think there are lots of opportunities and lots of you know, good efforts being done right now at finding the right data, having the right, let's say, information available, and then sharing amongst not only organizations and also leading actors, but looking to help specific countries in their transition process as well. So I think I will stop there, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Susanna, for highlighting the work that GGGI, as I call you, or GGGI, has been undertaking. And I think you mentioned some interesting aspects that we need to bring on board here. It's your last point that is key to look into the skills base that you have in order to develop the renewable energy potential that you have in a country, and you specifically mentioned the studies that you are doing in Mexico. You also highlighted the importance of including the potential for job creation in energy plans, and I also was struck with your proposal that we need to address or basically use the employment generation potential as actually a criteria for project selection. I think that was a really good proposal, and you also highlighted the importance of good data, which of course is a challenge to many of us. So thank you, Susanne, and then let me introduce then Vic van Buren from ILO. Which policy areas do you see as essential to ensure just outcomes from the deployment of renewable energy, and what action-oriented measures can governments and social partners initiate to address labor market issues as the energy transformation unfolds? Vic?
Thank you very much, and hi from Geneva at the ILO office. Firstly, I'd like to thank and congratulate IRENA on a powerful and innovative report, which not only provides an up-to-date status on jobs in the renewable energy sector, but also raises a number of new policy aspects that are essential for a more and ambitious energy transition. I'm confident that the report will bring a new piece of evidence for policy insight in pursuing our common goals under the platform. I'd like to start by bringing attention to the broad policy context, which we must navigate as we consider specific areas that are essential to ensuring just outcomes from the deployment of renewable energy. At the moment, we're facing a human crisis, an economic crisis, and an environmental crisis, and you can't deal with one without the other. We need to have a human-centered approach as we build back better and look at the four capitals: people, communities, the economy, and the environment together. Obviously, today we're talking about the environmental component, and if we drill down to renewable energy, we see that fossil fuels provide 85% of total global energy. And under current policies, the share is only going to shift a little bit by 2030 to 77%. And so there's a huge task out there. We've got the data which has been given to us in the report. We know what can be achieved, but we're only achieving the tip of the iceberg at this stage. The policy area is much broader than just the new economy. We've got to deal with the current situation as well. There's a need for a massive industrial transformation that is required in order to bring about a positive impact. And so the point that I'd like to raise firstly in this process is the managing of the transition. As the world moves towards an economy more reliant on renewable energy, it is important to manage the process in a comprehensive manner. More energy from renewables will mean more workers in this subsector and less workers in the fossil fuel industry. Today, we have some 30 million workers in the fossil fuel production. An important area of policy for a just transition is going to be reskilling, and we've heard this from our previous speakers, and upskilling of workers who may be deployed into the clean energy space. The same goes for 15 million jobs in the automobile industry. We're going to have to go through that same transition process. For those workers that can no longer move into other occupations for whatever reason, age is one of them, there's going to have to be other schemes of early retirement, social protection schemes to make sure that there's a just transition. If we don't do this, there's going to be a kickback by communities, by workers, by governments, by industries, and we need to factor this in as we move ahead. There is also the political, important political economy considerations in moving to a new economy. And therefore, it's commendable that the report has taken up these issues. In France, we see that the Total has announced that it will convert its Grand Puy refinery at Saint-Amand into a zero crude platform for biofuels and bioplastics. By 2024, they're going to invest 500 million euros into these 4 new industrial activities. And they've mentioned that they're going to have no layoffs, provide early retirement and internal mobility within the company, such that each worker will be provided with an appropriate option. This is laudable to see this happening. It is critical that we engage with major industry actors on the broad agenda for change. Process is going to be equally important as content, and dialogue is going to have to be at the table. We can't just go into a regulatory framework mindset with governments and avoid talking to workers and the employers and the enterprises. This is going to have to be a social pact of some sort, that as we move ahead and provide the necessary regulatory framework on this. We need to make sure that there's worker representation. We find in the old mining sectors there's a very strong union movement, but as we move into the renewable energy sector, there's very little representation of workers, and we need to find mechanisms that allows the voice of the workers to be heard. Therefore, I come back to the point of the importance of social dialogue. Enterprises need empowering policies, and that's where governments need to provide the regulatory framework and the environment in which the industries can take these decisions that are required. We have an ILO enterprise program in Zimbabwe, which is an example of supporting skills development and entrepreneurship to support the deployment of renewable energies with a focus on women and youth. And that has been raised. We've heard the point of the gender component being raised, but we need to include the youth in our thinking going ahead, because this is where there's a huge need to look at the future of our youth. In this regard, I'd like to echo the message from the report that greater effort needs to be put on decentralized energy systems, which offer massive opportunities for decent work and especially for the youth. It also has the capacity to address the unwanted labor migration, another component. If we can provide young people with opportunities, skills, and scope, we start reducing the need to migrate. And the last point, and my closing point, is that we need to support women participation. And this has been raised, but I think we need to repeat it consistently, as there is a need to increase the representation of women in the renewable energy sector. The ILO report on skills for a green future published last year found that most of the emerging occupations in the green economy broadly tend to be captured by mid-career male workers. I think I'm going to stop at this point, but we look forward to the debate. We look forward to participating and supporting the other partners in this area, and to joining hands in making sure that renewable energy gets its space and becomes a key factor in delivering on the future and building back economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Wick, for highlighting that we need a human-centered approach to building back better. There is as you also eloquently outlined, there is a need for a large-scale industrial transformation that will require actually a lot of reskilling and upskilling of workers. You also highlighted that there is a need for a social pact, and the process and dialogue with workers would be key in order to ensure that we will have a just transition. And you also, towards the end in your intervention, focused on the youth and the large potential that we have especially in decentralized renewable energy sector. And then also that you highlighted the importance or the task we have at hand in ensuring that we have more and appropriate jobs for women. So thank you very much. I've been alluded to the fact that we still have a possibility to come with questions. So please, if you have questions to any of the presenters, you can write them in the chat to us, and then we will pick them up. So then let's move to Aurélie Beauvais. How can private companies and governments work together to ensure that socio-economic benefits such as employment are shared widely? And what role do you see for industrial policy? Aurélie, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Hans, and hello everyone. It is a pleasure to be there. So I'm the policy director of Solar Power Europe, which is a European trade federation of the solar industry. And we represent today more than 230 companies which are active in Europe and worldwide. So even though my focus is mostly European, obviously I will try to enlarge a bit the vision for the sake of today's discussion. And I would start obviously indeed by congratulating IRENA for the work which has been done on this report. I think I would completely echo what Suzanne said. It is absolutely essential at this point in time to have more data on the socio-economic benefits of renewables and a better apprehension for policymakers on actually the job potential of each technology. And as a representative of the solar sector, I can only be very proud that the solar sector has really established itself notably as one of the biggest job provider. It is not a surprise, obviously, from my end. But it's also positive to see that the growth remains extremely uneven across countries, and so the potential for further growth when it comes to job remains immense. So looking only, for example, at Europe, noticing that only one European country is part of the top 10 when it comes to job providers tells us that we do have a lot more to do together. So coming back to your question, how can industries and governments work together, and what could be the role of an industrial policy? I think indeed an industrial policy here is absolutely central, but of course in all its dimensions. And governments and industries have to work together in the first place to keep growing the market. Because even though we are in a situation where the renewable sector at large is growing significantly, we have seen that boosting growth of renewables and adding more and more renewables, simply looking at installations and deployment, remains one of the biggest chunk of job creation at global level. And here, obviously, I think we are not there where we should be. We have progressed significantly, but looking, for example, at the barriers which we still encounter when it comes to permitting, when it comes to access to land for renewables, when it comes to having actually detailed and visible government policies and auction frameworks, this is really something that would provide more confidence to the industry and therefore would enable much more cost-efficient deployment of renewables, which would obviously create a lot of jobs. And I have to say here, there are no really good studies, even though we look at Europe, which has been a bit pioneering, for example, the development of national energy and climate plans. We just released an assessment at Solar Power Europe on how the 27 countries are performing in this regard. And I have to say that we are still missing robust frameworks and the information that would be useful for industries and especially to reduce the cost of finance. So this is indeed one barrier that we see, and where we could see a role in the recovery plans, notably. So governments have been consulting industrial stakeholders to understand how they could actually leverage renewables to create more jobs as part of the recovery plans. And it is clear that measures such as additional tenders, from our perspective, could be something very simple that would already unlock significant jobs. And we have seen some countries like Malaysia pioneering the way, so why not more countries there? One other way to echo one of the main conclusions of the report, obviously, is that also from our end, decentralized energy systems are extremely important to create jobs. And this is also where we need much more collaboration between governments and industries. First, looking simply at residential level. I cannot echo more the data that we have at Solar Power Europe. We have made a study 3 years ago, and it showed clearly that rooftop installations, for example, create 3 times more jobs in the solar sector than utility scale. But if you add to that the jobs you create in the construction sector and the overall ecosystem, local ecosystem that you have, it's much more. So only looking at the residential installations, we should see from the government side much more willingness to engage, for example, in pan-European solar rooftop programs to tackle actually the gap that we have and the potential that we still need to tap on. Looking at Europe, for example, the rooftop potential, the cost-efficient rooftop potential, could cover today 1/4 of Europe's electricity demand, looking at the latest study from the Joint Research Center, which is an organism of the European Commission. So boosting rooftop segments and also having an approach where rooftop works hand in hand to support the competitiveness of businesses. So here you would not only create jobs in the rooftop segments per se, but also help companies to grow in Europe while keeping their sustainability under control. And so PPAs or deploying more rooftops on the commercial and industrial segments is something that we see as one of the big missing links, in fact, of many governmental policies in Europe, for what I know best, but probably it is the case on many other markets. If you look only at Europe, the potential for commercial and industrial installations could be 140 gigawatts in 2030, and we are today at 55 gigawatts for the C&I sector. So that means a lot of growth ahead and a lot of jobs. And obviously for that, we could also envisage, for example, that governments could provide state-backed guarantees for PPAs and to help SMEs basically engaging much more into mid-size self-consumption installations. This is something that we have seen in Japan in their recovery plan. And again, why not in Europe? A side question to this that will remain relevant, but I think it's important to have it in the picture. The biggest bottleneck we have to deploying even more decentralized solar installations and decentralized renewable installations is the network. And so I think this challenge has been very well identified by several players, notably as well IRENA and the IEA. But if we don't work on tariff designs and if we don't work on developing markets that are adapted for distributed generation, especially in markets that are very connected like Europe, we will hardly see a strong growth of decentralized energy. One last aspect maybe of what could be an industrial policy creating jobs further, obviously manufacturing has to be a key part of the picture. We see an increasing interest for manufacturing across Europe, but also in other markets. So for example, Solar Power Europe is cooperating with the Indian Solar Association, NSEFI, to also understand how we can better basically lay down best practices between Europe and other markets to develop further manufacturing. Manufacturing is not going to be the biggest job creator, but that is absolutely a critical pillar of a sustainable solar strategy in general, and the same for renewables, obviously at large. Maybe I will simply conclude to say that when it comes to the industry side, we also see skills as a very big challenge. So it is a matter of just and fair transition, but it is also a matter of simply being able to achieve our targets. Today, we simply do not have the workforce that we need as companies to have higher ambitions and to deploy even more. And that is really a pity indeed. So we need to work on trainings. That's true. At European level, we envisage, for example, that it could be a work for a European tender at large. I mean, we need to put in place almost in a systematic way the development of government-supported trainings across all countries. On the same side, we do need to support the professionalization of the industry. So the certification of trainings, the certification of companies that are working in the sector will also help workers to be more credited on the markets, because we don't have such thing in the solar sector, for example, as a certificate for training centers. And that's something we need to solve. And also when it comes to university programs, I think companies have a key role to play. And already some of them are pioneering the way. So with basically public and private partnerships between universities and companies. We have seen that in particular for companies that have very complex technologies, like building integrated PV, where the technology is so complex that they know if they don't do it themselves, that they will just not have the skilled workforce. So they directly partners with universities to make sure that maybe in 5-6 years time, they will have people able to install their technology. And we should have a much more systematic approach to that, maybe taking example on what could happen in the US or in the UK with a stronger involvement of companies into university courses. And that would be it from my side. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aurélie. It's quite clear what you are saying, that we that represent governments, we have our job to do in terms of making sure that we are developing the right policies and also removing some of the key barriers. Of course, you're representing the largest employer in this sector. 1/3 of the 11.5 million is actually in the solar sector, and you also highlighted the large potential in Europe, and you also highlighted the importance of decentralized solutions and a job creation potential in decentralized. There's still a huge potential to scale up, but you're faced with large barriers. And it was interesting to hear that even in most countries in Europe, you're still missing the robust framework. So I'm going to pose a question to you that you can answer later on after we've gone through all the panelists. But what's your opinion on the European Green Deal, and how could you use the European Green Deal now in order to address some of these barriers that you mentioned? You also highlighted the need for manufacturing, and you also underscored really quite well the need for skills, upskilling and skilling activities, because you don't have the workforce actually to scale up, and that's something we really need to address jointly. So Rebecca, Shirley, what is needed to better understand the opportunities for job creation and livelihoods through decentralized energy applications? Many of the previous panelists have actually mentioned the potential in decentralized. And then also, how can we ensure good quality jobs for women and men? Rebecca?
Thank you so much. Apologies, I'm no longer on the webcam. We've had quite fittingly a power outage here in Nairobi, so I'm calling in from my phone. Thank you for the question, Hans. And let me start by just saying thank you for having me as a panelist. I'm really enjoying the discussion so far. I myself am the Chief of Research at Power for All, which is a non-profit organization focused on enhancing and advancing the role of decentralized renewable energy solutions in our collective goals for universal energy access. To answer your question, as Rabia noted in her beginning or introductory remarks, there's very little data available currently on jobs creation in sub-Saharan Africa outside of South Africa, as can be seen by reading the annual review itself. And where there is that little bit of data, there's even less data on decentralized renewable energy technologies, as all of the previous panelists noted. So last year, our organization published the first comprehensive job survey to decentralized renewable energy companies in Nigeria and Kenya. We also explored companies in India. And we developed a statistically relevant sample of over 150 companies within the decentralized renewable energy space. Just for the audience, so they have an understanding of what we're talking about here, this is everything from solar home systems to solar lanterns to commercial and industrial solar installations to mini grids to solar irrigation and productive use. So with that sample, we could estimate the gross decentralized renewable energy employment for 2017-2018 at the country level, including both direct formal and direct informal jobs. What we found from this research and the statistically relevant sample is that already in the countries that we surveyed, and in particular Kenya and Nigeria, the decentralized energy sectors are already creating as many jobs as is on par with, say, the utility sectors. So for instance, in Kenya, we found about 10,000 jobs being created directly, so not even including indirectly or informally, but just directly through working with decentralized renewable energy companies. There's roughly the same order of jobs as is created by, say, KPLC, the local utility company here. Not only do we understand the gross numbers, but we understand what the workforce profile looks like for each technology type in terms of gender breakdown. So we know that about 25% of jobs are taken by women, 75% by men. We understand age breakdown. So we know that about 40% of these jobs are taken by youth. We understand the breakdown in terms of compensation and any differences between local and foreign companies. So even what I say all of that to say that even with 1 year's worth of data, that's so much more than we had access to before that it tells us a lot. And what it makes clear also is what we need to do to understand more, which is your question. So I'll say 3 things. One is that we need to have more data. I'm partial as a researcher, but we need more years of data collected to understand the trends, to understand what happens as companies progress and scale. From our data, we see that there is a positive correlation between sales, age of company, and jobs. So we're already starting to see that as companies scale, there's likely to be this increase, but we really don't know and need better data to understand. Also, we have to understand what COVID will mean for future jobs creation. So that's number one, is more data to understand the trends. Number 2, in order to have a better understanding of the opportunities, is this area of productive use. Now, our study and our survey to companies showed that companies themselves have very little insight into productive use jobs creation, or where they do have insight, can't place strong confidence in those numbers. This is simply because tracking productive use job creation is not usually a performance metric for companies. And so it's not something that they tend to track. So our best guess tell us that perhaps something on the order of 5 times as many jobs are being created in productive use spaces as are created directly through employment with these companies. That's a guess based on literature. So clearly, given that sheer scale of job creation in this space, this is an area that we need to understand far better than we do right now. The third thing I would say is that we really need a better set of macroeconomic data to help us understand the trickle-down effects throughout an entire economy. What do these jobs mean for displacement? What do they mean for indirect jobs creation in other sectors of the economy? To really understand how jobs creation presents opportunities, not just directly working for companies, but throughout a broader economy, we need better data to pair these bottom-up data sets with. So that's to answer your first question in terms of what do we need to better understand the opportunities. Those are 3 areas that I would highlight. Just to quickly answer your second question on how we can ensure good jobs for both men and women, what we are finding from the data is that the decentralized renewable energy sector actually outperforms the broader renewable energy sector in a couple of areas. For instance, we found that over 2/3 of jobs in the decentralized renewable energy workforce are skilled and full-time, with an average retention being more than 30 months. We also found that average compensation is falling within the middle income range for both of the countries mentioned before, Nigeria and Kenya. So we're already seeing that there is some opportunity and potential here for really creating not just jobs, but good jobs for men, women, and youth. I think to ensure that we are maximizing on the opportunity for these kinds of jobs, 3 things again I would mention here. One is we definitely heard both from the companies and from the broader sector, i.e. government stakeholders, CSOs, industry associations, etc., that there's a major gap around the pipeline. So getting people and graduates from technical vocational training centers or from universities into the job market for decentralized renewable energy companies is a real challenge. And so addressing this gap, this pipeline, and creating whether it's programs directly through universities or otherwise to create sort of a flow of graduates into these spaces is critical. The second thing that we note is when you look at the kinds of jobs that are being required of the space, and as I mentioned, we have a very high resolution on the workforce profile for each different type of technology. We see that the kinds of jobs that are being created are, for instance, not just in STEM fields, science, technology, education, engineering, and mathematics, but also in law, in marketing, in sales, in finance. And we're seeing that there's also a need for encouraging these sectors of or these disciplines that are not usually thought of, right, when we think about renewable energy. And on top of that, what companies say is that the soft skills of organizational strategy, of health and safety, of leadership, of workplace policy, those softer skills are often missing in the job market. And so developing programs, again, to support companies in onboarding those skills for the job market and for graduates is critical. And the third thing I would say, again, just to echo some of the comments that Rabia made earlier, is the development of standards around jobs for compensation, for safety, and otherwise. This is a very nascent sector, the DRE sector. And so helping the sector to develop standards will, again, ensure that these jobs are not just there, but that they are good jobs and good livelihoods for men, women, and youth. So let me stop with that, Hans, and see if you have any other questions.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, for presenting some of the survey results that Power for All have actually presented to us. I think it was quite interesting figures that you presented, and of course I was not surprised to hear that we need more data. Of course, that applies to all of us, and your focus on productive use and the importance of also collecting macroeconomic data. It was also interesting to hear that you focused on that decentralized actually outperforms many other areas, and that it provides actually good jobs. And I think that's a key word in terms of moving forward, and the issue that we also need standards for the decentralized sector as well. So then let me move to Harish Hande. So Harish, what are the challenges and recommendations for successfully reskilling and upskilling workers for new opportunities, particularly in the energy access and productive use context. Harish?
Thanks, Hans. Hans, thanks, and congratulations to DG and Rabia, as well as to Michael, for this whole report. I think you've been carrying the flag of livelihoods and jobs, one of the very, very few institutions in the world which is pushing this whole concept of livelihoods and jobs for RE in the critical manner that you're doing, and thanks for that. It's high time we did that with this patience and rigor. So I just want to come from the demand side rather than the supply side, because the danger of looking always from the supply side is that we will get into the same trap that the utilities have faced over the years. While they would create jobs, but they would be non-inclusive jobs, and that's my fear. And I'll come back to a little later that we are comparing ourselves to the traditional utility sector, and it's like that's the typewriter, and we have to now look more in terms of, rather than refixing the economy, we should rethinking the economy is a much better term to look at, that we have now been given a chance for all the wrongs that we have done. And that's exactly why DRE plays a very, very critical role, that we should get away from it's not DRE or renewable energy. The beauty of renewable energy is that it creates entrepreneurs. It helps entrepreneurs to create more jobs. Very less future is going to lie on the first part of manufacturing side. Most of it is going to be on the demand side, on the livelihood side, and democratization of livelihoods, democratization of jobs. And that's the beauty of renewable energy. And then we should not miss out. Otherwise, we're going to be in the same issue like large utilities are going to be. Like there are two. One is the direct. Direct means, in a sense, DRE actually provides a lot of opportunities to local entrepreneurs at the place where we are. What COVID has actually taught us, that centralization is the biggest disaster that we all have faced. Let's take it for disaster. It's been a disaster. Central economy, large banks, large jobs, scale up has failed. This exactly led to migration, loss of jobs, and everybody, if it was so wonderful, why did the economies around the world tank so much? We need to create bubbles of 100 kilometers, 200 kilometers, and 300 kilometers, looking at local production of power, local creation of jobs, and local consumption of everything else, leads to a larger sustainable world that we all hoped for many, many years. Now that we have got a chance, let's do that. That's direct jobs. Like you create entrepreneurs, right? Whether it's a woman who's running a roti rolling machine, a person who is running a solar powered silk weaving machine, a person who is running a solar powered rice mills. These are direct jobs because of the decentralization, and I don't need to have power lines. I can create jobs. Those are thousands of jobs that are being created in the decent. That's direct. Now, the second is not the indirect, it's an enabler. Let's look at 100 farmers, very small farmers. As temperatures are rising, they're not able to, and out of that, 90% of them are growing perishable goods. Many of them have lost their jobs of incomes. That's because they're not able to sell their perishable goods at the time with the price that they actually require. Decentralized cold storage running on solar enables 100 jobs to actually come back, or 100 livelihoods to come back. So solar, in fact, enabled those 100 to come back, which no other technology would have actually helped those 100 come back. That is the enabler. The power of jobs and entrepreneurship is direct, and enabler, that's thousands and millions that if you actually go to work. Third for me is that if we think the same way from the supply side, I have a fear that we are thinking in non-inclusive. Non-inclusive in the sense that we are going to see what are the jobs that are created by large economies like China, India, America, because that's where the manufacturing bases are. And what we are going to use the poorer countries are, we are going to use the labor to do last mile sales and in the name of jobs, and potentially entrepreneurs that are going to be created. Let's create enabling systems for potential good high quality jobs at the countries which are poorer, where DRE actually makes sense. Otherwise, we're only going to count these jobs wherever there's a large manufacturing of batteries and BOS and large winds, and many of the smaller countries will be excluded of it. Fourth, gender. We always talk about gender not there, but we hardly talk about why it's not there. What are the enabling conditions that will make? And I never see much documentation of why. We know, yes, it's happening, but what is it that needs to happen? For example, and especially after COVID-19, the pandemic, the biggest sufferers are women, because if a lot of the families and migrant families have moved back, and now when people are calling them back for jobs, women are left behind in the villages, obviously because nobody wants to take the risk of taking the families. Numerous millions of women who had actually gone up the ranks in economically have now gone back -2. And DRE actually provides a platform for many of the skilled women who have now returned back and have lost jobs in the rural areas to get a chance to actually be. For that, we need appropriate financing by the policymakers, appropriate training for. So see, upskilling that Hans you talk about, upskilling is not in terms of jobs. Upskilling in terms of how do we link up to new markets? How do we create entrepreneurs? The entrepreneurs will then create jobs. We have to look at gender rather than saying it's 20%, 25%, 30%. I think those statistics I've heard for ages, previous 5%. Now I like to hear which are the institutions that are actually investing in the ecosystem and say 40% more money has been allocated for women. That would transform rather than 45% women have gone in. No, let's create the ecosystem for it to enable for women to take it rather than saying that women have to come in. Yes, but how? And I think DRE is a fantastic way to get the women back in terms of jobs, as decentralized energies, decentralized economies, decentralized bubbles, leading to decentralized consumption. And the best is producing electricity where they actually need it. And that's where the best sustainable model. So it's not about reviving the economy. It's a rethinking economy that we have got this small window of 1 more year. We, all of us, have a chance to actually do this. And for us, DRE is one of the very few sectors where the youngsters are hopeful that critical job and livelihood is going to come back with respect, rather than when the insecurity that has been created in the world about what's going to happen to my job, no, DRE actually provides that safety net, Hans. So I think it's a huge potential. I think we need to rethink a little bit differently rather than just looking at it as jobs. It's a whole life around us.
Thank you very much, Harish. As always, you challenge us, and I will then actually ask my fellow panelists here to respond to some of the issues that you brought up later on. And of course, you called for rethinking our economy, and you highlighted the fact that we basically have a year in order to take action, in order to turn things around, because we still it's a high risk that we fall into the same old trap and continue in the same way that we've always done. And I was really struck with your strong focus on this distributed renewable energy solutions and the potential to create entrepreneurs and jobs, and turning also the gender question a little bit around. Why is it not there, and what can we do in actually order to change and the potential that we have in DRE. But now let's finally go to Michael Renner as one of the authors. Michael, the energy transition will create growing numbers of jobs in renewable energy, but many fossil fuel sector jobs will be lost. And what do we need to do to limit misalignments and disruptions? I think many of the speakers have already been addressing some of these issues, but if you can add a little bit, that would be great. Michael, your floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Hans-Olaf. I think, as you say, indeed, various of the panelists have already addressed some of these aspects, but let me sort of try to maybe give a bit of a summary sense of some of the things that are really quite key. And let me start by saying that when we look at our modeling results, and I think those of other entities, we do find that, of course, ultimately, if we get the policies right, the number of renewable energy jobs that will be created will probably far outpace the number of jobs that will be lost in the fossil fuel or the conventional energy sector, right? So mathematically, that's great, right? The overall numbers look good, but I think it's really important to say that this is not the end of the story by far, right? I mean, this is almost the beginning of it only, because I think very importantly, it depends on where, when, and how jobs are created and are lost. And just as a note on the side, and this has already been touched upon, I think, as well by a couple of speakers before, we should certainly not lose sight of the fact that we need to look at the quality of the jobs, the pay of the jobs, and these kinds of matters as well. So it's not just numbers alone, of course, right? But in terms of the potential labor market misalignments that we see unfolding as the energy transition really takes its course, I think there are at least 4 different ways that this can happen, and I think that we need to be on guard against. So one is temporal, right? So the creation of new jobs does not necessarily take place on the same time scale as the loss of employment. The second one is a spatial or geographical issue. New jobs are not necessarily being created in the same place as those where, as the places where the jobs are being lost. Sectoral is the third aspect. Job gains and losses may affect different parts of the economy. And what that reflects, I think, is typically that there are different supply chain structures that are underlying the renewable energy industry and the fossil fuel industry. And I think quite closely related to that is the fourth aspect, which is the potential of occupational misalignment. The skills associated with the jobs being lost do not always really match, at least not match closely, those that are being required by the new jobs. So the question, of course, becomes, so what do we do about this, right? I think it's fair to say that policymakers can really rely on a whole range of tools with which to address this issue, and for hopefully bringing about a very beneficial outcome for pretty much everybody. Let me mention a few policy areas. One is, first of all, education and training policies. We need to make sure that in this area, we are focusing on the emerging and evolving skills needs. And I think that's, goes to what Harish was saying, that we not only look at what we often call the modern energy sector, but we look at the energy access context as well, and not be sort of, too narrow in our views on this. But I think the point is really to be very, very forward-looking, very future-oriented. Part of what that implies is that we need to pay special attention to analyzing opportunities for reorienting the skills and the expertise of workers in the fossil fuel sector towards the clean energy sector. So we know, for example, that there are certain commonalities, certain overlaps between offshore oil and gas and between offshore wind. But I think it's fair to say that we need to really scrutinize very closely where retraining is an option and where it isn't, and act accordingly. So second area of policies, labor markets. Governments need to offer really proactive employment services, career counseling, and so on. I think this plays a role alongside with the private sector efforts in terms of mentoring, networking efforts, and so on. In some cases, I think it's fair to say that facilitating labor mobility may be needed, and this goes back to the spatial misalignments that I had mentioned before. So we may need to look at things like relocation grants or other forms of assistance where that is really the key way to respond to what's playing out. Third, social protection measures. I think the experience, particularly in coal-dependent areas, tells us that economic transformations take time. They are not easy. They can be difficult. They cannot work, they may not work as well as we might want them to. So some communities may not be able to adjust rapidly or easily. And I think this is especially the case where we look at regions or communities that are not well diversified economically, that where really like coal or some other sector is really so central that it's difficult to get out of that dependence. So there is this need for, I think, some measure of social protection along the way. This could mean extended unemployment insurance payments. It could mean guaranteed incomes for a period of time. It may take other forms of support. Let me bring up the fourth issue of policy, industrial policy, and this has come up, I think, in earlier presentations or responses as well. I think generally it's fair to say that the chance of people finding jobs rises with very active economic development efforts. So there's a need to build up supply chains, there's a need to invigorate local economies. What we at IRENA have been talking about, I think, in a variety of reports and activities that we have undertaken is that there are certain measures to leverage and enhance the viability of firms along the supply chain. We may think of enterprise incubators, regional industry clusters. We may want to look at carefully designed incentives to nurture young industries. We may have to consider preferential access to credit and land. In the renewable energy sector particularly, some countries have had pretty good experience or pretty interesting experience with what is often called local content rules. But I think the design of them, the particular context is really, really important to get it right. So lastly, let me say, I think what we really need to think of is not in terms of very many different policy areas that are very disparate and very separate from each other, but rather to see how they can all come together in terms of an overall public policy intervention. To some extent, I think that can be tied together by making sure that there is adequate funding, adequate financial resources for the energy transition. So we do need to make sure that we mobilize not just public money, but also enable the private sector to step up its game far more than has been the case so far. But I think the money alone, again, is not what's really alone important. What is really important is that it fits into a very strategic approach. So I think what's more and more important as the energy transition unfolds and accelerates is that we design public investment strategies, public policies that can guide the transition, that can support economic development, especially but not limited to the regions that are directly affected by these changes within the energy sector itself. So my final thought I want to share is that I think what's important ultimately is that the success of one policy measure ultimately really rides on the progress in all the others. So I would finish with a plea, with a proposal that we look at this really from a perspective of needing very coherent and very holistic approaches to our policy making. So thanks again, Hans-Olaf.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that final plea, and I think that applies to all sectors that we're working on, that we need a coherent approach. But I see we have a few minutes for questions. I've gotten a number of questions. I posed one to Aurelie, so what I intend to do here is I'm going to read out some of the questions that we've gotten, and then I will give you each 2 minutes to answer some of these questions. And then whatever other comments that you would like to provide to us, also building on what Harish said. But there's one question that would go to all of you, and that's the question of communication. How do we communicate the job benefits of renewables to those deciding on economy stimulus packages, and also building on Michael's last point in terms of designing the required policy measures. And another one is, whilst recognizing the need for skilled workers from technical graduates and universities, how can we ensure that current coal workers are not left behind? Because generally speaking, it's hard to take a coal worker and put him to work in the renewable energy sector. And of course, phasing out coal will be an important fact for us. Also a question on the issue of if it would be better for LDCs to reform, least developed countries to reform their policies such that they will be able to create more jobs through manufacturing solar PVs locally and using hybrid indigenous our resources instead. There was also a question to you, Michael, on the methodology, because there are different numbers between 2019 and 2050 projections from what I picked up. And also a question on the role of ministries of education and key education providers. How do we actually engage with them in terms of ensuring that we have the right level of expertise that we need to in order to train all the people that we need to. And then I think you also mentioned it, Michael, in your interventions, but maybe to Vic also in terms of workers, because in many cases we don't have the skilled workers in the region where you need them to be. And Michael, you also mentioned this. How can we actually create a more vibrant renewable energy job market, and how can we remove barriers such as work permit, visa restrictions in some cases, and then if political pacts can be reached to advance employment across borders. So then I'll give you each about 2 minutes to address some of these questions, and then any final comment that you would have. Let's start with Susanne. We go in the same order as we did the first round. Susanne?
Well, thank you very much, and a great set of questions. I think on the leaving nobody behind, or the possible victims of, let's say, the transition process, there's no doubt that you will have to look forward and actually design training programs for occupations in need. But I think there is a role for multilateral organizations, and certainly I would probably point to ILO and other actors as well, that there is a possibility to sharing international experience and best practice for enhanced learning, and also you can carefully anticipate employment shifts that may be necessary to implement the energy transition, so that you can do a well-managed approach to avoid or minimize the adverse impacts and risks to workers, communities, and businesses. So it does require that there is a robust sort of transition and right policies in place, promoting participation, social protection, and reskilling. And I do know that there are already good examples of well-designed schemes addressing the issue of employment shifts and impacts in specific sectors, and certainly coal mining, that the shift has been, let's say, long-standing there. So a lot of lessons have been learned in that area. So I'm pretty sure that with joint efforts and sharing of best practice, we could address that. So I think I'll stop there and leave the word to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Susanna. Vic.
Thank you. I think we need to recognize that in the developing economies in particular, we often are experiencing ILOs. We go with programs and projects and we have a small victory, but we're not able to scale up. And one of the reasons we can't scale up at the grassroots level is because there's a lack of national policy and cohesion in the developing economies. And so we have to start on a long-term basis of getting the right policies and the right framework in place where companies and people can flourish. The education systems in the developing economy are largely lagging behind. We're producing unemployable youth. I come from South Africa, and I worked across 23 countries there until recently to Geneva. And time again, we find unemployable youth coming out of the schooling system. They're not recognizing what is needed for the future, like the renewable energies environment. And I agree that governments will have to be more flexible so that they can allow for where they don't have the skills to allow other workers to come in and fill the gap until they do get it. From a communications point of view, I think we've got to go on a branding strategy. It's not just a matter of making information available, because this is an unknown area for many. And when you start talking to a rock driller in the mine in South Africa, he doesn't understand the nature of renewable energy. And so there's a fear of the unknown and saying, well, let's keep the status quo because we don't know what's going to happen to us. So there's got to be a branding and a plan of how to move and move into that transitionary phase. But let me stop there. I sound like a preacher. I'll go on too long. Thanks.
Thanks, Vic. Aurélie.
Yes, thank you. So maybe I will just bounce back super quickly on the question you asked before on the overall opinion on the Green Deal, because it can shed a light in any way on the what needs to be done more at global level in order to tap into the deployment potential of renewables. I think for us, the main takeaway is that ambition is great, but you need to give yourself the means to achieve that. So I think the Green Deal is extremely ambitious, but when we asked our companies actually, so that means we need higher targets. Do you want higher targets? And the reply was, no, we don't care anymore about targets. Just help us bring the installations on the ground. And so that's why what I was referring to when it comes to grid in particular and having flagship initiatives like concrete voluntarist government policies, that's what is needed at global level in order to unlock the potential of renewables, also for job creation. Now, when it comes to the questions on addressing, for example, the needs for reskilling, I will not touch upon the one on communicating to governments, because I think we've come so much about data that's really the starting point. We need data to communicate in the first place. But for our workers, I think we also need to come back from the conception that, for example, coal workers are not at all adapted to renewable energy technologies. In fact, there was a report from the Joint Research Center of the European Commission already in 2016 that highlighted that there was actually a great overlap, if we can call it that way, between the skills that we have today informal coal workers and in the coal sector in particular with some of the needs that we have today in the renewable sector. But obviously, one way we do not answer this question is that if we only focus on the youth and the universities, and that's essential because it's the workforce of the future, then we will have a lost generation, which is all the workers that we have today, and it is significant. And here again, I think voluntarism is the best way. So we need governments to actually propose and support training programs. We have a lot of training centers, but we do need to help them and to put in place a government program in order to redirect the workers that are losing their jobs directly towards reskilling programs, which don't have to be 10 years time. It can be 2 years, for example, and then have them operational to start very quickly. And maybe in the context of
Aurélie, I need to move on.
No worries. Yes.
Thank you very much. We are shortly running out of time. So then a quick word from Rebecca.
Yes, thanks. I think I'll answer the communication question, and I think that preaching to the energy choir is not maybe our most effective strategy. But if we take what we do know to the industry associations, to the ministries, to the recruitment agencies, to the universities, to the TVET institutions, that's I think where the real change happens, and that is in part largely a communications exercise. And so leveraging local media is really critical. We've already seen that the findings that we've produced out of the report last year were directly able to impact recruitment agency strategy. Some universities in Kenya directly responded to the call to develop new master's programs to address skills gap already, and the data is already currently being used by the Ministry of Labour to develop policy. So communications is really key. What we find is that even with the little data that we have, there's more that we know than we're using right now. So let's use what we have effectively. For instance, I think one of the speakers earlier was saying that we know, not so important to know the numbers, but better to understand why women are underrepresented in the workforce. And that's already, there's so much writing on that, so much understanding of that already. I think it's not about reinventing the wheel and creating new data, but really making sure that we have proper communications of the data that we do have and ensuring that we're communicating to the non-energy stakeholders that need to be at the table to address these more systemic issues. So I'll leave it there. I know we're short on time.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Harish?
Thanks, Hans. I would just say rather like, for example, if I had to work with Rabia, say, are there 50, 70, 100 specific champions who are champions and not bracketing them? Incidentally, they work in different departments of different governments, especially in the vocational schools. Can we bring those champions together 10 by 10 by 10 into IRENA's webinars, for example, and say, this is the potential? Can we convert 10, 100 champions whom we know can move the needle? Let's not use the word large governments, because then it gets lost. Who are the 100 champions who can actually make it happen? And if that's our goal for the next 365 days, specific target to each of these 100 champions in different governments, in vocational schools, health sector, education and livelihoods, we should be able to move the needle.
Thank you. Excellent suggestion. Michael, short from you.
Thanks, Roland. Hans Olaf, I'll take the one on methodology. So just to explain a little bit, the basis of the report that we are releasing today is basically we are doing a very large scale survey of what's out there in terms of available data and information. So we look at government statistics, we look at industry associations and their findings, we look at academic studies, we do some of our own estimates based on mostly on employment factors. So in that sense, of course, the resulting estimate that you see in this report is quite different from the one that Rabia briefly talked about in terms of the 2030 and 2050 basically projected employment numbers, right? Because there we're talking about the results of econometric modeling, which is based on a couple of scenarios that our colleagues in the Bonn office are drawing up there. There are two scenarios. One is called the transforming energy system scenario, which is ambitious and basically will allow us to stay within the demands of the Paris Climate Agreement, keeping temperature rises well below 2 degrees Celsius. The other one is really more reflective of current commitments and policies, so less ambitious, of course, needless to say. Now, the ambitious scenario basically tells us that by 2050 we have to reduce, or we will reduce emissions by about 70% from today. The role of renewable energy would step up from about 16-17% to today to I think about 65%, if I remember the number offhand correctly, in 2050. So this scenario is really what's out there that we are modeling, and where we're looking at the socioeconomic impacts, including employment, including GDP, and including human welfare.
Okay. Thank you very much. I see that we are running out of time, but if you allow me, just before closing this event and handing back to the DG of IRENA, for me, this event has clearly demonstrated 4 points. First, the importance of tracking the socioeconomic impacts of the energy transition. And of course, for many of us, the key is actually the number of jobs. And for the decision makers, this is invaluable information to examine opportunities to create domestic value, develop the coherent policy frameworks, and address education and training needs. And we need a communication and branding strategy in terms of moving this forward. Secondly, it's quite clear that renewable energy actually creates jobs, and employment is increasing steadily. It's encouraging to see the share of women in the sector is growing, but it needs to increase. And I think Harish posed both some hard questions to us as well as some solutions. Then also next year, we will then get more data on how the sector will be able to withstand the impacts of COVID-19, and also if the stimulus packages will prioritize renewable energy. So it will be interesting to attend the launch next year and see your figures. Third, it's also quite clear that we see some winners and maybe losers in this race, clearly demonstrated by the strong performance in some regions, Asia in particular, and of course this will also have geopolitical impacts. Fourth, which has been underscored by all panelists, the energy transition must be a just one, because it will provide opportunities for and challenges for regions, sectors, and workers. And we need to put in place mechanisms to deal with the socioeconomic impacts of this transition. So for my part, let me thank the presenters, the panelists, and participants for attending this event. And I'm encouraging all of you to access the report at IRENA's website. So with those words, I'm handing back to IRENA, I believe DG Francesco Lacamera. Thank you.
Thank you, Hans-Olav. And
thank
you really to you, to Rabia, to the panelists, to the participants. And I thank you for your observation, comment, question. And I think that it comes from all the presentation, the fact that this publication and the possible contribution to jobs coming from the choices that we are going to do in the short term, responding to the pandemic, and the fact that it's not the only challenge that we have in front of us, because in the same time we have the challenge of the climate change in front of us. So there are very simple questions that we have to answer in choosing the kind of policies we want to put in place, what kind of projects we want to encourage. So as Susanna said, how much contribution to GDP and jobs can bring the policies and the solution that we want to encourage with the public money that we are going to spend as we respond to the COVID-19. How much contribution these policies, this choice can give in terms of CO2 reduction, how economically they will be. So how much dollar for a ton of CO2 emission reduced? What is the time to getting this result if you want to be in line with the Paris Agreement? And if we just try to respond to this very simple question, the choice for going to renewables is very simple to provide. And I want to make clear to you and to everyone listening, and I want that this message can come from IRENA stronger and stronger in the month to come. But it's not just that we make a technological choice. The other question that we have to respond is also to understand if the policies that we wish to undertake are designing the future, are looking for the future. What is the future for people like us that is working in this field? Is to have a clean energy system, think we all share this goal. As been said during this discussion, that we are going towards a decentralized system, in some way a more democratic energy system. We all wish that everyone can access to the energy services. And I think that we also want that there should be a more just distribution in the role of the industry sector in developing and developed countries. So we have to change completely an approach that sometimes comes from the old relationship between developed and developing country, where the one are giving technologies and the other just giving raw material. So we have to also to think about how to build the industry that is coherent with the future we want for all the citizens of the world. And I want to say that we have to be very careful that when we talk about the future is not to mitigate the past. So the choice of, in terms of technologies, in terms of the future we want, cannot look on how to minimize the impact of the CO2 coming from the old energy system. We have to look for something that is in line with the future that I have just previously described in very general terms. We have to look for an energy system that in the future should be more resilient, should be more sustainable, and should be just. And that's the reason, again, for going for renewables. It's not just a technological choice. It is a vision that we have for our society and our society in the future. So naturally, the reskilling is very important in this passage. It's important to communicate better with the companies, as been said. And we, as IRENA, we have launched these guidelines for guiding possible collaboration between IRENA and the company that want to go for renewables. As has been said, we have also possibly, and we are discussing among ourselves how we can better communicate all these kind of things. Naturally, also the champions, we are trying to work with the youth. We are also building a squad of emissaries, of high prestige people to bring the message around the world. So there is a lot of things that we have to do. So again, the choice of renewables is not just for going from a technology or another one. It's just a choice that look for the future, that a future that can look better for all of us, developed or not developed, or developing countries. Thank you very much for your attention and for your participation again. Thank you very much.